next thing to think about is the UV unwrapping. This is going to need a little bit of an introduction if you're completely new to unwrapping in Blender, and we'll use this bike seat as a little bit of an example. If I go Control Space to head back to the regular layout workspace, we'll see there's actually already a UV editing workspace for us. That's pretty handy. It's going to take us into edit mode on our bike seat, and on the left we have our UV editor window. Now we don't really need to see the scan to shrink wrap to, so I'm going to turn off the visibility there. And now we're good to go. So the basics of what we need within Blender to start working on our UVs is a 2D UV editor window, as we can see there, of course, and then also the 3D view so that we can visualize those UVs, how they might be stretching, or we could apply a checker map onto our model. And we can also see which parts of the mesh correspond to which parts of our UV map we've got. We also have a UV menu up at the top there, and we also have a UV menu up on the top of the 3D view, which is basically the same menu that you get when we press the U to unwrap shortcut. We've also got shortcuts such as Control E to help us mark seams and clear seams, which are going to be useful shortly. And we also have that same menu available to us within the 2D view as well. All right, so with this preamble out of the way, the only other thing to really consider is the fact that we have kind of two major modes of visualizing working with UVs within Blender. One is going to be keeping them in sync, which is going to be with this button in the top left, which is currently disabled, and this current view, which is basically going to only show us UVs that we have selected. So if I select some of the faces here, we can start to see some UVs showing up at the bottom there, which are all actually squished. So with that done, I'm going to press U to unwrap, and now we can see that we're starting to get something a little bit more useful to us. These faces will now display that part of the image texture that we might have. Eventually, in our case, of course, it's going to be the color and normal map bakes from our high resolution scan. All right, so to actually see all of the UVs within our 2D editor, within this particular mode, that is not having everything in sync, it means that we're going to need to select everything to see the entire UV map, which isn't very clean at the moment. So the way I'll start this off is just jump in straight away using the U menu, and then what we'll do is we'll try the Smart UV Project. This will try to break up our mesh based on the angles between certain faces that we have currently set to 66 degrees, and we can give a little bit of margin between the islands, which we want, so I'll just take that up a little bit, and we can kind of ignore the other settings for now. So let's click OK. And here, because we don't have that many islands, this is actually looking pretty good right away, which we would expect to some degree because this is a fairly simple shape. So thinking more about the two major modes of visualizing working with UVs, we have this one, which is not keeping things in sync. And we have this other mode, which when we enable it there, we can see everything lights up because we have everything selected. Which means if we're looking to try and find this particular face on our UV map, we can easily see it light up by simply selecting it in the 3D view. Similarly, that's the same as if we were to select a face here, and then we wanted to know where that was on our model. We can find that apparently just here. Now with this mode, it's worth keeping in mind that we're not really seeing the UVs as such, we're seeing the vertices. So what I mean by that is if I press 1 above the QWERTY keys there, we can switch to vertex select mode. And if I select this UV, or these UV coordinates, we'll see that's not really just simply that area. We actually have also selected this area down here. So this is something that can get us a little bit in trouble if we're just working up here and we're thinking, right, yeah, let's just move this over here. Let's slide this up there, because we're actually going to be moving these as well, which we might not want to do. And also because we've had snapping on, we can see we have a snapping option up here, and I'm just going to disable that. So this being representative of the vertex in the view means that we're moving several UVs at once, whereas if we switch our mode and then select everything and then come back over to this area, we can see we're only moving around that area of the UVs. And we have a few ways in which we can alter this using this menu. We can actually disable this altogether, but the UV selection is grouped by shared location by default, which is what we have there, and then we can also just do it by shared vertex, which is actually very close to how our other mode is working, as we're able to see different UVs related to the same vertex being moved there. So I'm going to switch that to disabled for a second and show that we can click and drag across there to just get access to this part of the UVs, but if there are multiple UV coordinates for every face corner, so for example, let's make it a bit more obvious here. We could actually pull these all out from one another, and we can see we've actually got 4 UVs in that one area. And this is the only real mode that we have full access to this, at least as simple as this. So I'm going to undo that and switch back to shared location. Now we'll notice that we have actually got a different set of selections up here. So when we're keeping things in sync, we just have vertices, edges, and faces. But when we take that off, we have a more UV centric approach. So these are UVs, edges, and faces, but we also have islands available now, as we can see there. But keep in mind, it is possible to actually get something very similar within our UV sync mode, which would just be selecting this one piece, and then we can just press L. Now, I wouldn't really advise to do it within vertex selection mode. We're better off to do this within face select mode. And now this does tend to isolate those UVs to just the area we want. And then when we press L, whatever island is under our cursor should get selected. This brings me to another point, is that these aren't necessarily stitched together. So in other words, if we wanted to move this, we could just move that face completely out of the way. It's not going to drag things along in the same way that we had when we were in vertex selection mode. And things work basically exactly the same when we're not in sync. So if I select this face, it does by default act as though everything is stitched together within face mode. But we do have the option to change the way that behaves by setting that to disabled. But again, I'm just going to keep that on shared location. So there are subtle differences between the two modes there, but the major thing to keep in mind is if we want to get really granular with the UVs, then we probably want to switch the keep syncing off, and that's going to allow us to specify exactly how we want to treat our UVs. And if we want to see what we're actually dealing with, which parts of the mesh we're talking about, we want our UVs and edit mode selections in sync, which is probably the most instructive and helpful most of the time. All right, the next thing to consider is that there's two major ways of UVing within Blender, and that's whether we're using seams or not. Seams are simply where we're telling Blender that we want the borders of a UV island to be, in the hope to reduce image stretching and make our UV layout more readable. We've already seen that we created these UV islands without specifying anything about seams. Rather, we used UV Smart Project to let Blender just figure it out without us marking where we want seams to be manually. So we could say that this UV Smart Project is an automatic UV unwrap solution. And by the way, probably the most versatile and most used of these automatic methods. Something to note, by the way, is that the lower this angle limit happens to be, the more islands we're going to get. And also, if it's a heavy mesh, which this one isn't, thankfully, but if it is a heavy mesh, then the longer it's going to take to calculate as well. So let's just see that in action. We can select everything, press U to Smart UV Project, and let's take this down to 10 and click OK. And now we have loads of islands, which is not really ideal. We want as little amount of islands as possible with the least amount of stretch as possible. So just while we're visualizing that, we can come over to this menu up here and we can click on the UV editing display stretch. If everything's showing as blue, that means basically there's no stretch. There is a little bit over here that we can see, which is a little bit stretched. Let's select everything again and press U and then Smart UV Project. And let's take that a little bit higher, like 80. And then click OK. And again, we can see that we're getting much less islands than we just had a second ago. But you can definitely see that there's more introduction of lighter blue hues, denoting a little bit more stretch going on. Anything light blue to dark blue is pretty much fine. Once we start getting green, or let's in fact test this out. Let's take this vertex right here and press G and really distort this face here. We can see that we're pushing it deep into the yellows there, which is not what we want. We can kind of do this a little bit manually by selecting a face and then going to select and then select similar and then choosing normal, for example. And then let's go down to the bottom left of the 3D view to adjust the select similar tools settings. And we can adjust our threshold to include a load of faces that could make for a good UV island. And then from there, we can just press U and then unwrap. And it's just going to unwrap our selection. And we can just go through the mesh like that. So Control I to invert and then U to unwrap that. And then we get our basic result there. And notice how the previous unwrap left a little isolated section. It's kept it isolated for us there. So it's actually two islands. But that's one way of unwrapping the model. Another way is actually denoting where we want our seams to be. Working with seams is a lot more manual work, but perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, often a much cleaner and more controlled result. So I'll start by switching to edge select mode. Alt A to deselect everything there, and then Alt left click this edge loop here, and then let's Shift Alt select this edge loop and this area here and this area. And I'm going to deselect that, and I'm just looking for this section that kind of hides underneath part of the back end of the seat. And I'm going to select this one and shift select this one and then go Control E and then mark seam. Now, if I, for example, go to select everything and let's reset all our UVs, and then we'll see every face now takes on this 0 to 1 range on both X and Y. And then if I go U and then unwrap, we'll see that pretty much it's a disaster, except this area that we just laid out. We don't need to see all of the UVs that we're yet to properly unwrap just yet though. And as a reminder, we won't see them if we go to the top left and switch away from keeping the mesh and UVs in sync. then it'll only be selected faces that show up. And so to do that, I'll select one of these faces and then go Control L. We'll see we're selecting linked all, and we've got a limitation at the seams, and we can see all of those UVs are held right there. Now with that, we're aware that this underneath area is really not requiring any UV attention at all. So I want to separate that off. So with that, I'm going to take that and Control left click and Control left click all the way around here until we get the border of all of the edges there that meet up with this area. And then we can go Control E and then mark seam. Control space to minimize that view. A to select everything, and then U to unwrap. Now we just need to shrink down the UV island that makes up our faces that will end up being mostly hidden. So I'll switch to Island Select, select the island, and then scale that right down because this really requires barely any UV space whatsoever. This area though is our main area really, and it's not looking too bad. It's looking like it's barely stretching. There's a little bit of an issue down here and up at the top. Perhaps there's a little bit of an issue as well, but I think I'm mostly happy with that. If we wanted to work within the UV window, then what we can do is just select, say, one of these UVs or one of the areas of this. Let's disable what Blender calls it sticky selection, and then we can just separate them and move this around until we feel like it goes the right kind of blue. And again here, so that looks like it would be better if it was separated. I don't think I would take this amount of time and attention on these kinds of things, to be honest, unless it was really in the camera and really noticeable. But should we want to give this area extra attention and make it less stretched, then all we would need to do is repeat the process we just did on the previous edge on another of the edges that look a bit more in the lighter blue stretchy zone. The problem here is, if we were to unwrap again, these splits that we've made in the UV seams would be ignored and become stitched back together once more. So the quick solution to that is just to use our Make Seams from Island tool once more. Just so that we can see more of what's going on, I'll press Control Space, and now we can see our 3D view as well. Also note I've got the Keep UV and Mesh Selection mode enabled here. For the tool to work, I'll need to press A to select everything. And then we're ready to use in our UV menu the Seams from Islands tool. And now we can see that that seam has been added. And we should have one on the other side as well, right there. All right, so with that done, we should be able to move all of these into position, although I'll do this in face select mode, R to rotate. Typically, it's a good idea to lay out the UVs in some kind of logical way. So this face right here, it would be useful if that was close to this face, which is at the top. So with that, I'm going to select these, Control L to select the rest, and then move these actually up to this side, and then place these in, something like that. And we're pretty much ready to call the UVs on this model complete. Just before wrapping up the unwrap section, let's throw in a few extra tips. So for example, we didn't really look at stitching, so we could simply switch to edge select mode, select this edge, and then press Alt V to jump into our stitch mode here, and we can see highlighted in green where the island is going to end up being. We can see down here the various options. One of the most important ones is the I to switch the island, which UV island is going to do the moving. Typically, we would want the smaller island to jump to the larger island, which is what it's doing by default here. So after this, I would just left click and that will confirm and make all the changes. Not going to do that just at the minute though. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that and talk very briefly about the fact that there's another unwrapping mode which we could do, which is just going to help us speed things up. And it's called the Live Unwrap. We can find that amongst our options under the UV section, Live Unwrap. And all that's going to do is once we select an edge and then go Control E to mark a seam, the second we do that, it's going to unwrap for us automatically. So something we'd need to be careful on there is if we had a load of UVs that we wanted to keep into position, we would need to select them. So I'm going to select this and then Control L to expand to the islands, and then press P to pin. We have all these options in our UV menu, of course. So for example, we have our stitch and we have our P for pinning and also Alt P to unpin. With that done, let's go back over to say this edge and then go Control E to mark the seam. Now we're going to keep these in position and it's only going to unwrap the UVs that weren't pinned. So with that, we can select all of these and go Alt P to clear that pinning. Something that works in conjunction with that is to tag our edges. So we can select this one, and then when we expand our selection by using the shortest path tool, so Control left clicking here, we can see we've actually got an option for edge tagging, and we can switch it from select to tag seam. Now that we've changed that, as we use our shortest path tool by Control and left clicking, instead of selecting those edges, it's now marking them as seams. This, in conjunction with Live Unwrap being enabled, means we'll see our UVs updating every click. To clear seams, we just control and left click over the edges already marked as seams. I'm going to control Z a bunch of times to undo all of that. And also I'm going to go to the options and turn the live unwrap off. And I'm going to make sure that we come over to our tool here and change that back to select. Another thing to note is that we can create a new image up here. So let's just call this UV Unwrapping. We'll use the 1024 defaults. And then instead of this being blank, we'll change this to a color grid and then click OK. Let's make this more obvious by coming to our menu here and turning off our display stretch. And now what we can do in our 3D view is come over and select texture. And then let's switch this over to a shader editor, close out the sidebar with the N key. And then to see the far right of the menu, I'll middle click and drag the menu to the left. Then since we don't have any materials in the scene, I'll create a new one. Then we want our UV checkboard image in our shader editor. There's a few ways we can do this. I think the simplest right now will be to left click and drag from the image icon next to the name at the top of the UV editor window. Then that image can be dragged into the shader editor. Then so long as it's there, selected in the shader editor, that's the texture we'll see in our 3D view solid shading. It doesn't matter if it's hooked up to the shader or not. It's perfectly fine if it's just sat there, noodleless, unconnected, free as a bird. Solid shading will accept it as it is. Now we can use this texture to see if there's any noticeable visual texture stretching. As you can see, the resolution's super low underneath, which is what we want, and everything's looking pretty good. One of the best things that this can visualize is whether they happen to be flipped or not. So if this was all mirrored writing, we know we've gone a little bit awry.